The night my mother finally humiliated me in public did not begin with cruelty. It began with applause. The Sterling Ridge Ballroom in Portland glowed under soft gold chandeliers, the kind that made everything feel important before a single word was spoken. More than 300 doctors, donors, and hospital board members filled the room, dressed in tailored suits and quiet confidence. They had gathered to celebrate my mother, Dr. Lorraine Walker, and her 42-year legacy in cardiac surgery. To them, she was brilliance, sacrifice, prestige. To me, she was the woman who had spent my entire life reminding me that I had chosen wrong. I stood near the back of the ballroom, half hidden by a column, holding a glass of water I had no intention of drinking. I watched my mother accept praise that rolled effortlessly off the stage and into the room. She had always belonged in spaces like this. Authority fit her like a tailored coat. I, on the other hand, had learned early how to make myself small around her success. Before we go on, please subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I really do read every comment. My name is Imani Walker, and this is the part of my life I never expected to say out loud. As my mother spoke about long nights in operating rooms and lives saved by steady hands, the audience listened with reverence. Every word reinforced the narrative she had built for decades. That meaningful work was measurable, prestigious, and publicly applauded. Everything else existed somewhere beneath that line, including me. I already knew what was coming. I could feel it in the way her speech slowed, the familiar rhythm she used when transitioning to acknowledgments. First came my brother, Marcus, praised as the future of medicine, a rising star following in her footsteps. The applause was immediate and sincere. She smiled then, a smile I had rarely seen directed at me. Then her gaze shifted across the room, landing where I stood. "And this," she said, pausing just long enough for the room to quiet, "is my daughter, Imani." I felt my shoulders tense. "Well," she continued with a soft laugh, "she teaches kids how to write little lines. Until she gets married, it'll do." The laughter came quickly, not cruel laughter, polite laughter. The kind that disguises itself as harmless while stripping something essential away. I stood frozen, my face warm, my heartbeat loud in my ears. In that moment, years of dismissal condensed into a single sentence delivered through a microphone. What no one in that room knew was that earlier that evening, an email sat unread on my phone, an appointment confirmation from the Ellington Foundation. I did not need to open it to know what it meant, and as the applause continued, I understood something with sudden, terrifying clarity. This night was not going to unfold the way my mother expected. The laughter faded, but the echo of it stayed lodged somewhere beneath my ribs. I did not move. I did not smile. I did what I had learned to do over years of moments like this. I stood still and waited for it to pass. Around me, conversations resumed in hushed tones. Glasses clinked, chairs shifted. To everyone else, it was a joke. To me, it was confirmation. That sentence had followed me my entire adult life in different forms. Sometimes it sounded like concern, sometimes like disappointment. Tonight, dressed up in humor, it sounded like permission for a room full of strangers to decide I was small. I tightened my grip around my phone in my pocket, grounding myself in its weight. A few minutes earlier, while my mother was still being congratulated near the stage, it had vibrated once. Just once. I had glanced down and seen the subject line before locking the screen again. Appointment confirmed. I did not open it. I did not need to. I already knew what it meant, and more importantly, I knew what it would mean to her. Across the room, my father, Daniel, sat near the front row, hands folded, posture careful. He did not laugh. He never did when my mother made comments like that. He also never stopped her. His silence had always been his compromise, a way to survive a marriage built around her certainty. My brother Marcus sat beside her, relaxed, proud, soaking in admiration that felt inherited rather than earned. As the applause settled, my mother continued speaking, unaware or unconcerned with the way her words had landed. She moved on to stories from her career, moments of triumph, difficult cases that ended in standing ovations from colleagues who knew the cost of her work. The room leaned in again. They trusted her voice. They always had. I drifted backward into memory, pulled by the familiar ache. Growing up, dinner at our house was scheduled and sacred. Every night at 6, without exception. My mother would sit at the head of the table, recounting her day like a lecture. Blocked arteries, impossible odds. Patients who survived because she refused to give up. Marcus would ask questions, eager, fluent in her language. My father would nod, occasionally adding a comment meant to affirm her brilliance. When it was my turn to speak, if I tried at all, I talked about children. About the 5-year-old who finally learned to write her name without crying. About the boy who stopped hiding under the table during group time. My mother would smile politely, then redirect the conversation back to medicine. There was always something more important to discuss. When I told her I wanted to study early childhood education, she laughed the way people laugh when they think someone is joking badly. She told me I was too smart for that it was a phase, that I would come to my senses. My father said nothing. His silence felt heavier than her words. Years later, when I completed my master's work in early neurodevelopment and intervention timing, she did not attend the defense. She said she was on call. I later learned she had been at a private dinner with colleagues. I stopped expecting her presence after that. Back in the ballroom, my phone vibrated again. This time, I looked. A new message from an unfamiliar number, brief and precise. Dr. Ellington has arrived. I lifted my eyes toward the entrance just as the doors opened. Dr. Renee Ellington stepped inside with the kind of quiet authority that did not ask for attention, but commanded it anyway. She was not on the program. She was not supposed to be here. Her presence shifted something in the room, subtle but undeniable, like pressure before a storm. I felt my pulse steady instead of spike. For the first time that night, I did not feel small. I felt ready. Dr. Renee Ellington did not make a dramatic entrance. She never needed to. She moved through the ballroom with calm precision, acknowledging a few familiar faces with polite nods, ignoring others entirely. People noticed anyway. Chairs subtly angled toward her path. Conversations thinned. Influence has a way of announcing itself without sound. My mother had not seen her yet. She was still speaking, still basking in the comfort of admiration, still certain the night belonged entirely to her. I watched that certainty like a fragile thing, knowing how easily it could fracture. 3 months earlier, long before the gala invitations were printed, I had been standing in my classroom, wiping paint off a table shaped like a flower when the email from the Ellington Foundation arrived. The subject line had felt unreal, almost invasive in its directness. Interview invitation. Director of Education. I reread it 3 times before allowing myself to breathe. The position rarely opened. It oversaw statewide medical grant evaluations tied to early childhood education, early intervention, and community health initiatives. Real funding, real authority. A role that required the kind of understanding I had spent years building quietly, without applause. I told no one, not my mother, who would have dismissed it as another detour. Not Marcus, who would have asked whether I planned to keep playing school. Not even my father, who would have advised caution without conviction. Some things needed to exist without commentary until they were solid. As the interview approached, my mother became increasingly demanding. She assigned me tasks for the gala as if I were staff. Pick up programs, coordinate seating, handle last-minute details. When I told her I would be unavailable that morning due to an important appointment, her voice sharpened instantly. "Important?" she repeated. "More important than your family?" I told her it was. The silence that followed was cold and incredulous. Then she said the words she always used to reclaim control. "If it matters more than this family, then go." She expected guilt to bring me back into line. Instead, it clarified everything. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that Northwest Regional Medical Center, the hospital where she had built her legacy, had submitted an $8 million grant proposal to the Ellington Foundation. And the position I was interviewing for would have direct oversight over applications like that. The collision was inevitable. Back in the ballroom, my mother finally noticed the shift. Her eyes tracked the line of attention drifting away from the stage, toward the entrance. Confusion flickered across her face, quickly masked by composure. She continued speaking, but her rhythm faltered. The event coordinator received a subtle signal and moved closer to the stage. He leaned in, murmured something to her. She stiffened. "Before we continue," he said into the microphone, voice careful, "we have a special guest who would like to say a few words." The room turned as Dr. Ellington approached the stage. My mother's expression changed the moment she recognized her. Surprise gave way to calculation, then to something dangerously close to unease. She stepped back, yielding the microphone with a practiced smile. Dr. Ellington took it without ceremony. "Thank you, Dr. Walker," she said calmly. "Your career speaks for itself." My mother relaxed, just slightly. Then Dr. Ellington turned her gaze toward the audience. "There is something important that needs to be clarified tonight." I felt the room hold its breath, and for the first time in my life, I was not afraid of what came next. Dr. Renee Ellington waited until the silence settled completely. 300 guests sat suspended between curiosity and discomfort, unsure whether this interruption was ceremonial or surgical. My mother stood beside the podium, posture perfect, smile measured, still believing she understood the rules of the room. "I want to take a moment," Dr. Ellington said, "to recognize Dr. Walker's decades of service. 42 years of commitment to cardiac surgery is no small achievement." Heads nodded. A ripple of relieved agreement moved through the ballroom. My mother's shoulders eased. Praise was familiar territory. Praise was safe. "However," Dr. Ellington continued, her tone steady but unmistakably firmer, "tonight is not only about celebrating the past. It is also about acknowledging the future." That word landed differently. She spoke about the growing importance of early intervention, community education, and integrated care. About how medical outcomes did not begin in operating rooms, but years earlier, in classrooms, homes, and clinics that rarely received the same respect or funding. Some people shifted in their seats, others leaned forward, intrigued. Then she said the title. "The Ellington Foundation has appointed a new director of education." The room stirred with confusion. This was not on the program. This was not expected. "This role," she continued, "will oversee the evaluation and approval of statewide medical grant applications connected to early childhood education and community health initiatives." A few doctors exchanged glances. A donor near the front frowned slightly, calculating implications. When she said my name, it cut cleanly through the room. "Imani Walker." For a split second, no one moved. Then the murmurs began. People turned in their chairs, looking back toward me. the daughter who had been reduced to a punchline minutes earlier. I stood slowly, aware of every step as I moved into the aisle. The silence deepened, heavy and electric. As I reached the stage, Dr. Ellington placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding, deliberate. She held up a folder. "This," she said, "is one of the largest grant proposals currently under review, an $8 million request from Northwest Regional Medical Center." My mother's face drained of color. "Director Walker," Dr. Ellington added, "will oversee its educational evaluation process." The room exhaled all at once. I took the microphone. My hands trembled briefly before stilling. When I spoke, my voice was clear. "I want to be very clear about something," I said. "Early childhood education is not babysitting. It is the foundation of neurological development, emotional regulation, and communication. The skills formed in early years directly affect how future patients describe symptoms, follow medical guidance, and survive crisis." I saw recognition flicker across a few faces. Others looked away. "Every professional in this room," I continued, "once learned how to hold a pencil, express discomfort, and trust adults. That learning matters. It always has." I returned the microphone to the stand. The program resumed, but the air never returned to normal. Applause came slower. Conversations felt cautious. My mother stared at the floor. Her certainty fractured in a way I had never witnessed before. For the first time, the room saw me clearly. And for the first time, I did too. When the formal program ended, the ballroom did not dissolve into celebration the way it had been designed to. The music resumed, but it sounded distant, almost inappropriate. People stood in clusters, their attention no longer orbiting my mother. Instead, they found their way to me. Doctors I had never met introduced themselves with a new carefulness. Administrators asked questions about early intervention models, about curriculum standards, about how educational outcomes would now be measured alongside clinical success. A few people apologized quietly for laughing earlier. Others avoided my eyes entirely. Across the room, my mother stood alone. For most of my life, I had watched people gather around her like gravity. Tonight, that gravity had shifted. She tried to recover her composure, greeting a donor here, a colleague there, but the ease was gone. Authority, once cracked, does not reseal easily. When she finally approached me, her smile was strained, her voice lowered. "I'm proud of you," she said. The words felt foreign, stiff, as if borrowed from a language she rarely used. I studied her face and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not triumph, but clarity. "Pride doesn't mean much," I said quietly, "when it only shows up after power does. I don't need you to be proud. I need you to respect what I do." She looked down, the smallest fracture in her composure widening. She did not argue. That alone told me how much had changed. In the weeks that followed, my phone rang more often than it had in years. Calls from my mother, careful now, measured. Questions framed as curiosity, but rooted in necessity. Northwest Regional Medical Center's proposal had been flagged. The educational component was thin, vague, insufficient. The foundation requested revisions. She asked if I could advise her. I told her all communication had to go through the proper channels. No exceptions. She did not protest. Months later, the revised proposal was approved at $4.5 million instead of the original request. The decision was not mine. I had formally recused myself. The standards were simply enforced as written. For the first time, my mother had to navigate a system she could not dominate. Something shifted after that. She began reading the research I had sent years ago and she had ignored. She asked questions about neurodevelopment, about emotional regulation. about why early language mattered so much. One morning, she called and asked something I never expected to hear. Could I visit your classroom? I agreed, not for validation, not for closure, but because understanding had to come from seeing. She arrived in sensible shoes and tailored confidence, then hesitated at the doorway, unsure how to enter a room full of tiny chairs and scattered crayons. She sat down among 5-year-olds, awkward and uncertain. I watched as the same hands that had steadied hearts in surgery trembled while helping a child hold scissors correctly. After class, she looked at me differently. Now I understand why you chose this, she said. I did not rush to forgive. I did not soften the moment. I let it sit. You don't have to understand everything, I replied. You just have to know that no job is small. She nodded. That was new, and that was enough. After my mother left the classroom that day, I stayed behind longer than usual. The children's voices had faded down the hallway, replaced by a quiet that felt earned. Tiny chairs were tucked beneath low tables. Crayons lay abandoned mid-color. Half-finished drawings clung to the walls with tape that had lost its stick. This was the world I had chosen long before anyone thought it mattered. For years, I believed I needed to justify this choice, to explain it in terms my mother respected, to translate it into something that resembled her language of prestige and urgency. I thought if I could just find the right words, she would finally see me. Watching her struggle to guide a child's hand along a straight line, I realized how wrong I had been. The validation I had chased for half my life had never been hers to give. And the power she held over me had only existed because I kept handing it to her. Hoping one day she would return, it transformed into approval. Walking home that evening, Portland's late daylight filtered through the clouds in a soft gray-gold haze. People passed me on the sidewalk. Parents juggling backpacks. Nurses still in scrubs faintly smelling of antiseptic. Construction workers with dust on their boots. Commuters staring at their phones. Invisible work happening everywhere, sustaining entire communities without applause. I thought about how many people live inside that quiet labor. How many are dismissed because their work does not glitter on a stage? How many shrink themselves in their own families to keep the peace? I used to believe smallness was safety, that staying agreeable would protect me from conflict. But silence has its own cost. It drains you slowly, convincing you that being unseen is the price of belonging. The night of the gala shattered that illusion. When my mother turned my life into a joke through a microphone, something in me refused to stay quiet. Not out of spite, out of self-respect. The moment Dr. Ellington said my name, the room shifted. Not just for my mother, but for me. I saw clearly the distance between who I had been taught to be and who I actually was. Once you see that distance, you cannot pretend it does not exist. My relationship with my mother did not magically heal. Respect is being rebuilt slowly, deliberately, brick by brick. Some days are easier than others, but the foundation is different now. I no longer explain my work as if it needs permission to exist. I no longer shrink to fit into someone else's definition of success. I stopped asking to be seen and started standing where I already belonged. That changed everything. And the most unexpected part? I did not win by defeating her. I won the moment I chose myself. In the weeks after the classroom visit, something subtle but undeniable shifted in our family dynamic. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way people like to imagine reconciliation, but in the quieter language of pauses, reconsidered words, and conversations that no longer followed the same rigid script. My mother called more often, not daily, not even weekly at first. But when she did, her questions were different. She no longer asked whether my work was still temporary, or whether I had thought about doing something more practical with my degree. Instead, she asked what I was researching, what challenges I was seeing in classrooms, why certain children struggled to articulate pain or fear long before they ever entered a hospital. Sometimes she listened in silence. Sometimes she pushed back, old habits surfacing in familiar ways. But even when she disagreed, she did not dismiss me outright. That alone felt revolutionary. My father noticed the change before I did. One evening, over a quiet dinner, he said, "She's reading again." I knew what he meant without asking. She had always read when she was trying to understand something she could not control. At work, the weight of my new role settled in. Grant proposals crossed my desk daily. Some were ambitious, others careless. Many treated education as an accessory instead of a foundation. I enforced standards with the same precision my mother once used in surgery. Clear metrics, real plans, qualified educators, no exceptions. Some applicants resisted. A few complained. But gradually, something changed. Proposals improved. Partnerships strengthened. Early education stopped being an afterthought and started being designed with intention. I thought often about the irony of it all. The very field my mother had dismissed as insignificant now shaped the future of institutions she respected. Not because I demanded recognition, but because the work demanded rigor. At home, I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head before seeing her. I no longer prepared defenses or explanations. When she made dismissive comments, I named them calmly. When she crossed boundaries, I held them. It was uncomfortable for both of us. One afternoon, she admitted something quietly, almost reluctantly. I didn't know how to value work I couldn't measure with outcomes I recognized. It wasn't an apology, but it was honesty. And sometimes, honesty is the first crack light gets through. I realized then that respect does not arrive all at once. It accumulates through consistency, through refusing to disappear, through choosing to remain whole even when others are uncomfortable with that wholeness. The gala had been the rupture. What followed was the slow, deliberate rebuilding, not of my worth, but of how others were allowed to engage with it. And I was no longer afraid of that process, because I had already survived being underestimated. Everything after that was just growth. There were moments, though, when the weight of it all caught up to me. Late nights reviewing proposals, early mornings answering emails from institutions suddenly eager to prove they understood education. Responsibility has its own kind of loneliness, especially when you step into it without the blessing of those who once defined your limits. Some nights, I replayed the gala in my mind, not with bitterness, but with curiosity. I wondered how many people in that room had laughed out of habit, how many had never questioned the hierarchy they were taught, how many daughters had sat quietly while their work was reduced to something smaller than it was. I began speaking at conferences, not as a novelty, not as someone's daughter, but as a professional with data, outcomes, and lived experience. I talked about early literacy as a health issue, about emotional regulation as a predictor of long-term patient compliance, about how classrooms were often the first place trauma surfaced, long before it showed up in emergency rooms. The reception surprised me. Doctors asked thoughtful questions. Administrators took notes. Some admitted they had never considered how deeply their outcomes depended on the work happening years before patients entered their care. Change did not come all at once, but it came. At home, the conversations continued to evolve. My mother no longer corrected me in public. When colleagues asked about my work, she described it accurately, if carefully. Progress measured in inches still counts. One evening, as we cleared the table after dinner, she paused and said, "I used to think respect was something you earned by sacrificing everything else." I looked at her, waiting. "Now I see that sometimes," she continued, "it's earned by refusing to disappear." She did not look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. I understood then that our story was no longer about validation or revenge. It was about redefinition, of success, of contribution, of whose work is allowed to matter. I had stopped trying to fit into the narrative she built, and in doing so, I had forced the narrative to expand. That expansion did not just change my life. It changed how rooms listened when someone spoke softly about work that sustained others quietly. And that, I realized, was the real power I had stepped into. As months passed, the memory of the gala stopped feeling sharp and started feeling instructive. It became a reference point rather than a wound. Whenever a proposal crossed my desk that treated education as an afterthought, I remembered the laughter in that room. Whenever an institution claimed impact without evidence, I remembered how easily confidence can masquerade as competence. The work demanded more from me than I had expected. Not just expertise, but steadiness. Every decision affected real programs, real families, real outcomes. There were days I felt the familiar pull to over-explain, to justify my standards in advance, but I learned to resist it. Authority, I discovered, does not need to announce itself loudly. It needs to be consistent. My brother Marcus was slower to adjust than my parents. For years, we had occupied separate orbits, his defined by recognition, mine by quiet persistence. At first, our conversations remained polite and distant. Then, one afternoon, he called with a question about a patient's child who was struggling in school. He asked whether early intervention could really change long-term outcomes. I answered him the way I answered everyone else, with data, with context, with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to be believed to be right. After that, the calls came more often, not because he suddenly saw me differently, but because the work demanded it. And that was enough. At home, my father became more vocal in small ways. He interrupted when my mother minimized something I said. He asked questions at the table that centered my work instead of redirecting it. These gestures were quiet, imperfect, but intentional. I accepted them without ceremony. What surprised me most was how my own internal voice changed. The one that used to second-guess every choice. The one that whispered I should be grateful just to be included. That voice grew quieter with every boundary I held. I stopped measuring my success by how well I fit into other people's expectations. I started measuring it by impact, by the quality of programs funded, by the children reached before they ever became patients. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about the younger version of myself, the girl who sat at a dinner table waiting for permission to speak, the student who clutched an acceptance letter and wondered whether wanting this life made her foolish. I wished I could tell her what I know now. That worth is not conferred by applause. That meaningful work is often invisible. That choosing yourself is not selfish. It is necessary. The gala had been a moment of exposure. What followed was a lifetime of alignment. And I was finally living inside it. The longer I lived inside this alignment, the more I understood how deeply I had been shaped by years of quiet dismissal. It had taught me to over-prepare, to anticipate resistance before it appeared, to assume my work would be questioned even when it was solid. Those habits did not vanish overnight, but they softened. At the foundation, patterns emerged quickly. Institutions that had never invested seriously in early education scrambled to retrofit programs once funding required it. Some adapted with humility. Others resisted, insisting that medical excellence alone should be enough. I learned how to say no without apology. I learned that clarity could be kinder than compromise. Not every decision was popular. A few senior physicians requested meetings, certain they could persuade me the way they had persuaded others for decades. I listened. I asked questions. I pointed to the criteria. When they left frustrated, I reminded myself that discomfort was not the same as injustice. My mother watched all of this from a careful distance. She did not interfere. She could not. For the first time, our professional worlds overlapped without her occupying the center. That absence was uncomfortable for her. I could see it. But it was also instructive. One afternoon, she admitted something I never expected. I built my career believing there was only one way to matter, she said. And I defended that belief by diminishing everything else. The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. It did not erase the past, but it named it. And naming something gives you the option to stop carrying it alone. I realized then that her cruelty had never been about me. It had been about fear. Fear that if other kinds of work mattered, her sacrifices might not be singular. Fear that the hierarchy she climbed was narrower than she believed. Understanding that did not excuse the damage, but it freed me from internalizing it. As my responsibilities grew, so did my confidence in moments of quiet leadership. I mentored young educators who had never been told their work belonged in policy rooms. I encouraged them to speak with authority, not apology. I recognized myself in their hesitation. At home, the dinner table changed. Conversations widened. My work was no longer a footnote. Sometimes my mother still stumbled, defaulting to old language. When she did, I corrected her gently. She accepted it more often than not. Respect, I learned, is not demanded. It is enforced through consistency, and consistency, once established, changes everything. I no longer waited for rooms to decide whether I belonged. I entered them already knowing I did. With time, the story people told about me began to change, not because I corrected it, but because my work made correction unavoidable. Invitations arrived from institutions that once would not have returned my emails. Panels asked for my perspective not as an add-on, but as a framework. I learned to recognize when I was being invited for substance rather than symbolism, and I declined anything that felt performative. There were setbacks. A few grants failed to produce the outcomes promised on paper. When that happened, I took responsibility publicly and adjusted criteria privately. Leadership, I discovered, was less about being right and more about being accountable. That accountability built trust faster than charisma ever could. My mother watched these developments with a mixture of pride and discomfort. She still struggled when colleagues spoke to me as an equal. Sometimes she interrupted. Sometimes she corrected herself mid-sentence. Growth is rarely linear. One evening, after a long day, she called and asked a question that surprised me. "How did you know you could do this?" she asked, not accusing, genuinely curious. I thought about it before answering. "I didn't," I said. "I just knew I couldn't keep pretending what I was already doing didn't matter." There was a pause on the line. Then she said quietly, "I wish I had understood that sooner." It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement of loss, of years spent narrowing her vision. Of a daughter she had underestimated not because she lacked ability, but because her work did not mirror her own. I hung up, feeling something unfamiliar, not closure, but peace. At work, I began building systems designed to outlast me. Clear standards, transparent processes, committees that included educators alongside clinicians. The goal was not to be indispensable. It was to be replaceable without losing integrity. That, I realized, was the truest measure of impact. At home, my father joked one night that the dinner table had become dangerously educational. We laughed. The laughter felt different now. It did not land at my expense. Sometimes, I caught myself waiting for the other shoe to drop, for old dynamics to reassert themselves. But they didn't. Not fully. The shift held. I no longer needed moments of public vindication to feel whole. The gala had been loud. What followed was quiet and enduring. And that quiet, built on alignment and self-respect, was something no one could take from me. There were days when the weight of responsibility pressed harder than any doubt ever had. Decisions landed on my desk that could reshape programs across entire counties. Early literacy pilots in rural districts, trauma-informed classrooms near emergency departments, partnerships that demanded trust between professions that had never truly collaborated before. I moved carefully, knowing that intention without structure could do more harm than good. I returned often to the classroom, not out of nostalgia, but grounding. Sitting on the floor with children reminded me why the standards mattered, why vague language and symbolic gestures were not enough. A program either worked for children, or it did not. There was no room for prestige in that equation. At the Ellington Foundation, the shift became visible. Review meetings changed tone. Questions grew sharper. Metrics replaced assumptions. Educators were no longer asked to support medical goals. They were invited to shape them. The work felt heavier, but also cleaner. My mother noticed the change in the wider medical community before she named it at home. Colleagues mentioned my work with a mixture of respect and recalibration. Some framed it as novelty, others as necessity. She listened more than she spoke. One afternoon, she admitted that a resident had asked her about early language development in post-operative pediatric patients. She had forwarded the question to me instead of answering it herself. "I didn't want to guess," she said. "I wanted to get it right." That mattered more than praise ever had. I thought back to the girl I once was, waiting for a turn at the dinner table, rehearsing sentences that never made it into the room. I wished I could tell her that silence does not make you safe. It only makes you easier to overlook. That clarity, even when it disrupts comfort, is a form of care. At home, boundaries became routine. When conversations drifted toward minimizing language, I redirected them. When expectations crept in, I named them. No drama, no speeches, just consistency. It changed the temperature of the room. My brother stopped introducing me as the teacher and started saying my title correctly. The first time he did it, he stumbled slightly, as if testing the words. I smiled and let it pass. Change, I had learned, does not need applause. Late one evening, as I organized notes from a long day, I found myself thinking about the moment my mother laughed on that stage. The humiliation that once felt defining now felt instructive. Not because it justified anything, but because it marked the boundary between who I had been and who I refused to remain. The work continued. Quiet, demanding, necessary. And for the first time, I moved through it without carrying the weight of someone else's doubt. Over time, the story stopped being something people whispered about and became something they referenced. Not the gala itself, but what followed. The standards, the shifts in funding language, the expectation that education be designed with the same seriousness as clinical care. I saw it in revised proposals that arrived clearer, humbler, and more specific. I heard it in meetings where educators spoke without prefacing every sentence with apology. At the Ellington Foundation, we began tracking outcomes across longer timelines, not just enrollment numbers, but language acquisition, not just attendance, but emotional regulation markers. The data told stories that had been ignored for decades. Stories that made it impossible to pretend early education was optional. My mother attended one of the presentations quietly, sitting near the back. She took notes. She did not interrupt. When questions opened to the room, she waited. When she finally spoke, she framed her comment carefully, citing a case from her practice and asking how earlier intervention might have changed it. People listened. Afterward, she said nothing in the car. Later that evening, she sent me a message with a single sentence. I should have asked you these questions years ago. I did not respond right away. Not out of punishment, but because I wanted to answer honestly. When I did, I kept it simple. We're asking them now. That was the truest form of reconciliation I could offer. As my role expanded, so did my understanding of leadership. It wasn't about standing at the center. It was about holding lines that others could lean on. About saying yes when it mattered and no when it protected integrity. About building processes that did not depend on personality or pedigree. I thought often about the invisible labor that had carried me here. The classroom hours no one applauded. The research no one read until it affected budgets. The patience it took to keep showing up when being seen felt unlikely. At family gatherings, dynamics continued to evolve. My mother still struggled with moments of reflexive hierarchy, but she corrected herself more often than not. My father stepped in when she didn't. Marcus asked better questions. None of it was perfect. It was real. I no longer felt the need to narrate my worth. I trusted it to speak through action. The gala had been a moment of exposure, yes. But the months that followed taught me something more durable. Respect grows where consistency lives. Authority holds where standards are clear. And dignity returns the moment you stop asking permission to keep it. I had built a life that no longer required translation. And that, more than any title, felt like arrival. There was a moment, months later, when I realized the gala no longer lived at the center of my story. It surfaced occasionally in conversations, usually as a turning point, but it no longer defined me. It had done its work and then receded, the way moments of rupture often do once they've forced a necessary change. What stayed was the work. Programs that once existed on paper now had classrooms, trained staff, and measurable outcomes. Hospitals that had resisted collaboration now asked educators to join planning meetings from the beginning instead of the end. I watched language shift in real time. Words like supportive and supplemental were replaced with foundational and integrated. That mattered. I learned to recognize a quieter kind of confidence in myself, one that did not need comparison or contrast. I no longer measured my success against my mother's career or my brother's trajectory. Our paths were no longer competing lines. They were simply different contributions to the same world. At home, this difference became easier to hold. One evening, as we cleared dishes, my mother paused and said something almost offhand. I spoke to a resident today about early screening, she said. I used your framework. There was no ceremony in it, no dramatic emphasis, just fact. I nodded, accepting it the same way I accepted everything now, without needing it to be more than it was. Later that night, I sat alone and thought about how long it had taken me to stop trying to be legible inside someone else's expectations. How many years I had spent translating myself into terms that never quite fit. Letting go of that habit had been harder than any public confrontation. The truth was, my mother had not been the only one underestimating my work. I had done it too. By internalizing her dismissal, I had learned to treat my own calling as provisional, temporary, something I needed to justify again and again. Stepping into leadership forced me to confront that pattern. It demanded that I take myself seriously even when no one else did. That shift changed how I moved through the world. I spoke more clearly. I paused less. I trusted my instincts without asking for consensus first. The work responded accordingly. So did people. Sometimes I wondered what my life might have looked like if respect had come earlier. Then I stopped myself. That question no longer served me. The path I walked had taught me something invaluable. That dignity is not given by family, institutions, or applause. It is claimed, and once claimed, it changes the shape of every room you enter. Looking back now, I understand that the night my mother laughed on that stage was never really about humiliation. It was about exposure. Not mine, but hers. Her certainty. Her narrow definition of value. Her belief that worth could only exist inside the boundaries she understood. That belief had shaped our family for decades. It had rewarded some paths and erased others. And for a long time, I had mistaken my quiet endurance for peace. I thought surviving inside her shadow was the same as belonging. It wasn't. Belonging came later. It arrived when I stopped asking to be understood and started insisting on being accurate. When I let my work stand without apology. When I allowed discomfort to exist without rushing to fix it. My mother and I are not suddenly healed. Some wounds do not close neatly. Respect is being rebuilt slowly, intentionally, brick by brick. There are days when old habits resurface, when language slips, when assumptions try to reclaim space. But the foundation is different now. Stronger, more honest. I no longer need moments of public recognition to validate my life. The work does that quietly, every day. In classrooms where children find their voices. In programs that catch struggles early. In systems that now have to account for the work they once dismissed. I live without shrinking myself to keep the peace. I speak without rehearsing. I choose without asking permission. And that choice has given me a life that feels whole. If you listened all the way to the end, thank you. It truly means more to me than you know. Before we wrap up, go ahead and like this video and share it if the story blessed you. Because stories like this are not really about family conflict or career rivalry. They are about the moment you realize that the approval you've been chasing was never the key. The door was always unlocked. You just had to stop standing on the outside. I did not win by proving her wrong. I won by refusing to disappear. For another story that fits your mood, click the video on the left. To hear the latest one, choose the video on the right.
The family reunion was planned for the last week of July at the Grandview Resort and Spa in Lake Geneva. 3 generations of the Patterson family, all gathering to celebrate my grandparents' 60th wedding anniversary. The reservations had been made 9 months in advance, coordinated through a group chat I'd been removed from after asking too many questions about costs. I'd booked my own room separately. Same hotel, different confirmation number. I preferred it that way. When I pulled into the circular driveway in my aging Subaru, my brother Derek was already standing near the entrance with his wife Brittany. They were unloading matching Louis Vuitton luggage from their Range Rover. Derek saw me and his expression soured immediately. "Really, Maya? You actually came?" I stepped out of my car, pulling my simple black rolling suitcase behind me. "Of course I came. It's Grandma and Grandpa's anniversary. We thought you'd have the sense to skip it." Brittany adjusted her designer sunglasses. "Given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" Derek laughed, harsh and sudden. "The circumstances where you can barely afford to be here? This place is $500 a night, Maya. Minimum. And that's before the resort fees and all the activities Dad has planned." "I'm aware of the rates. Are you? Because last I checked, preschool teachers don't exactly make bank." He looked at my car, my suitcase, my simple cotton dress. "You're going to stick out like a sore thumb all week. Designer dinners, spa days, golf tournaments. How exactly are you planning to pay for all that? I have savings. Brittany snorted. Savings. Right. Listen, Maya, we're not trying to be mean, but this is embarrassing. For all of us. You showing up in your teacher clothes with your teacher car, counting pennies while the rest of us are trying to enjoy a luxury vacation. Then don't be embarrassed. I'll keep to myself. That's not how family reunions work. Derek stepped closer, lowering his voice. Look, there's a holiday in about 15 miles from here. Much more your speed. You could still come to the anniversary dinner on Saturday, but the rest of the week you could just not be here. I already have a reservation. Which you probably can't afford. Maya, come on. Be realistic. My sister Charlotte emerged from the lobby, her heels clicking on the marble. She took one look at me and sighed deeply. Oh no. Maya, what are you doing here? She has a reservation, Derek said. I'm trying to convince her to cancel it. Charlotte's perfectly made-up face creased with worry. Maya, sweetie, did you talk to Dad? Because he specifically said he didn't think you should come. He didn't want you to feel pressured to spend money you don't have. Dad said that. Well, Mom said it. But Dad agreed. Charlotte touched my arm gently, her manicured nails bright red. We love you. You know that. But this week is going to be expensive, and we know teachers don't make much. We don't want you going into debt just to keep up appearances. I'm not going into debt. Then how are you paying for this? Derek challenged. Seriously, Maya. Show us your bank statement. Prove you can actually afford to be here. I don't need to prove anything to you. See? Because you can't. He turned to Charlotte. She can't afford it. She's going to put it all on credit cards and then spend the next 5 years paying it off. It's irresponsible. My father appeared in the doorway, his golf shirt crisp and his expression stern. Behind him, my mother wore a flowing resort dress and concern. Maya. Dad's voice had that disappointed tone I'd heard my entire childhood. We need to talk. About what? About this. He gestured vaguely at me, at my car, at everything. Charlotte told us you were still planning to come despite our conversation. We didn't have a conversation. Charlotte had a conversation with me where she suggested I shouldn't come. Because we're worried about you. Mom stepped forward, her voice pleading. Honey, this place costs a fortune. Every meal, every activity, every little thing. We don't want you to bankrupt yourself trying to keep up with everyone. I'm not trying to keep up with anyone. Then why are you here? Dad's question was sharp. If you're not trying to prove something, why insist on coming to a resort you clearly can't afford? It's Grandma and Grandpa's anniversary. And you could celebrate that at the dinner on Saturday without spending thousands of dollars you don't have on a week at a luxury resort. He crossed his arms. Maya, I'm going to be blunt. We don't want you here. Not because we don't love you, but because we don't want you embarrassing yourself. Or us. The words hung in the air between us. Embarrassing you, I repeated slowly. You know what I mean. But his eyes shifted away from mine. You're a teacher. You make what, 40,000 a year? Maybe 50? And you're standing here at a resort where people drop that much in a week. You don't belong here, and deep down you know it. Brittany nodded supportively. It's like if I tried to hang out with actual celebrities. Sure, I could technically be in the same room, but everyone would know I didn't belong. It would be awkward for everyone. We just want to enjoy this week, Charlotte added. Without worrying about you. Without feeling guilty every time we order wine or book a spa treatment because we know you're sitting in your room counting dollars. I won't be in my room counting dollars. Then what will you be doing? Derek demanded. Because all the activities Dad planned are expensive. The golf tournament entry alone is $300 per person. The wine tasting is $200. The sunset yacht cruise is $500. Are you going to sit them all out? Just wander around the resort by yourself while the family does things together. Or worse, try to join in and put it all on credit cards, Brittany added. Which is just sad, Maya. Really sad. My mother's eyes were wet. We're saying this out of love. We don't want you to spend the next year digging yourself out of debt because you were too proud to admit you couldn't afford a vacation. Find a motel you can afford, Dad said firmly. Something reasonable. You can still come to the anniversary dinner. But the rest of the week you need to go. This isn't your world, Maya. It never has been. I looked at each of them in turn. Derek with his arms crossed, confident in his superiority. Brittany checking her phone, already bored with the conversation. Charlotte looking sympathetic but immovable. Mom wringing her hands, worried but agreeing. Dad standing rigid, waiting for me to comply. Okay, I said quietly. Dad blinked. Okay. I'll leave. You won't be embarrassed by me. Relief flooded their faces. Mom actually smiled. Oh honey, I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. We'll see you on Saturday for the dinner and it'll be lovely. No pressure, no stress. Sure, Mom. I got back in my Subaru, started the engine and drove out of the circular driveway. In my rearview mirror, I saw them already moving toward the entrance, laughing about something, the tension of the confrontation dissolving like it had never happened. I drove exactly 1 mile down the road to the coffee shop in the small town center. Ordered a lot. Sat down at a window table with my phone. Then I made a call. Good morning, Miss Patterson. James Hendricks answered on the first ring. James was the regional director for Grandview Luxury Resorts, overseeing all 7 properties in the portfolio, including the flagship location in Lake Geneva where my family was currently checking in. How can I help you? James, hi. I need you to pull up the reservation for the Patterson family reunion. It should be under Gerald Patterson. One moment. I heard typing. Yes, I have it. Party of 23, booked through Saturday. Presidential suite, 4 luxury suites and 6 standard rooms. Very nice group booking. I need you to flag it. Flag it how? Owner review. All charges, all activities, all privileges. I want to be notified of every single thing they do this week. There was a pause. Is there a problem? Let's call it due diligence. How many complaints has that property received in the past quarter? Lake Geneva? Maybe 3 or 4. Nothing serious. Why? And how many has it received about the Patterson party specifically? None that I'm aware of. But they just checked in 20 minutes ago. Right. Well, keep me updated. If there are any issues with guest behavior, staff treatment, anything at all, I want to know immediately. Of course, Ms. Patterson. I'll make sure the property director is aware. Thank you, James. I ended the call and sipped my latte. Through the window, I could see the lake sparkling in the distance. The Grandview Resort sat on the northern shore, all glass and elegance, with its private beach and championship golf course. I'd bought it 3 years ago. Well, I'd bought the parent company that owned it, along with 6 other luxury properties scattered across the Midwest. The total acquisition had cost me $42 million, funded by the tech company sale that my family still knew nothing about. Because I'd never told them. After teaching for 6 years, I'd spent my evenings building an educational software platform. Something I genuinely cared about, that helped teachers manage classrooms more effectively. I'd worked on it alone at first, then hired developers as it gained traction. Within 3 years we had 12,000 schools using it. When a major education technology corporation offered to buy it, I'd said yes. The sale netted me $68 million after taxes. I'd kept teaching for another year because I loved it. Then I'd quietly transitioned to consulting and started investing. Real estate felt tangible, understandable. Hotels seemed like a natural fit. The Grandview chain was struggling when I bought it. Good properties, poor management, no vision. I'd replaced the executive team, upgraded facilities and implemented new training programs for staff. Within 2 years we were profitable again. Within 3 we were thriving. My family knew I'd changed jobs. They knew I did something with consulting. They'd never asked for details and I'd never offered them. When I showed up in my sensible car wearing Target dresses, they'd made assumptions. I'd let them. Now I was wondering if that had been a mistake. My phone rang. James Hendricks again. That was fast, I said. You're going to want to hear this. He sounded tense. I just got a call from Margaret. She's the property director at Lake Geneva. Apparently your father demanded to speak with management about 10 minutes ago. About what? He's claiming there was a booking error. Says a room was reserved under the name Maya Patterson, and he wants it cancelled immediately. Says the person who booked it isn't actually coming and he doesn't want to be charged for it. I closed my eyes. What did Margaret tell him? That she couldn't cancel a reservation without authorization from the guest who made it. He got aggressive. Started saying he's the head of the family party, that he should have authority over all the bookings, that it's ridiculous a hotel wouldn't listen to a guest spending over $50,000 for the week. 50,000? I whistled. He's really going all out. Apparently. Margaret held firm on policy, but he's demanding to speak to her supervisor. He's in the lobby right now making a scene. Tell Margaret I'm coming back. 20 minutes. You're coming here? I own the place, James. I can come whenever I want. I heard him smile. Fair point. I'll let her know. The drive back to the resort took 15 minutes. I parked in the owner's reserved spot, a space my family would have walked right past without noticing, and entered through the side entrance that led directly to the administrative offices. Margaret Chin was in her office on the phone looking stressed. She was 53, brilliant at her job, and had been with Grandview for 6 years, 3 before my acquisition and 3 after. We'd worked closely during the renovation process. She knew my family was here. She didn't know they were my family. She looked up when I walked in and relief flooded her face. She wrapped up her call quickly. Miss Patterson. Thank goodness. James filled me in. Is my father still in the lobby? Your father. She blinked. Gerald Patterson is your father? Unfortunately. Oh no. Oh, Miss Patterson, I'm so sorry. If I'd known. You handled it exactly right. Don't apologize. I sat down across from her desk. Tell me what happened. She explained the confrontation. Dad had approached the desk demanding the cancellation. When the front desk clerk explained they needed authorization from the guest who made the reservation, he'd raised his voice. Said it was absurd that a hotel wouldn't work with its biggest spender of the week. Implied the clerk was being difficult on purpose. Demanded a manager. Margaret had come out, reiterated the policy, and offered to try calling the guest to request authorization. Dad had refused, saying it was unnecessary, that he was telling them to cancel it and that should be enough. He's still out there, Margaret said. Sitting in the lobby with your mother and siblings, complaining loudly about poor customer service. Other guests are starting to notice. I see. I stood up. Let me handle this. Are you sure? I can have security. No security. Not yet. Let me talk to them first. I walked down the hallway toward the lobby, my footsteps silent on the plush carpeting. Through the glass doors I could see my family clustered near the fireplace. Dad was gesturing emphatically while talking to Derek. Mom looked embarrassed. Charlotte was on her phone. I pushed open the doors and walked straight to the front desk. The clerk, a young woman named Sarah who'd been with us for 8 months, looked relieved to see me. Miss Patterson, she said quietly. I'm so sorry about the situation. You did great, Sarah. Don't worry. I raised my voice slightly. Now, I understand there's an issue with a room reservation? Dad's head snapped up. He strode over to the desk, ready for another fight. Finally, someone with authority. He didn't even look at me, his eyes on Sarah. I need you to cancel a reservation made under the name Maya Patterson. The guest isn't coming and I refuse to pay for an empty room. I can't cancel that reservation, sir, I said calmly. Why not? I'm telling you she's not coming. Because the guest who made the reservation is standing right here. He turned to me then really looked at me for the first time since I'd entered. Maya? What are you doing here? I thought you left. I did leave. I came back. Why would you? He stopped, confused. Wait, did you talk to them? Did you convince them to let you stay? I don't need anyone's permission to stay here, Dad. Yes, you do. I'm not paying for your room. You want to be here so badly, you can pay for it yourself. I am paying for it myself. I always was. With what money? Derek had joined us now, Brittany at his elbow. Maya, seriously, this is getting pathetic. Just admit you can't afford this place and go. I can afford it. Stop lying. Dad's voice was rising. Other guests were definitely watching now. We all know you barely make enough to cover rent. You drive a 15-year-old car. You shop at Target. You're a preschool teacher, for God's sake. I was a preschool teacher. Now I'm a hotel owner. The silence was immediate and total. Charlotte laughed nervously. What? I own this hotel. And 6 others. I turned to Sarah. Sarah, can you pull up the ownership records for Grandview Lake Geneva? She typed quickly, her fingers shaking slightly. Yes, ma'am. Property owned by Grandview Luxury Resorts, LLC. Principal owner, Maya Elizabeth Patterson. That's... Dad's face was white. That's not possible. It's very possible. I bought the company 3 years ago after selling my educational software business. The sale netted me $68 million. I invested $42 million of it in acquiring Grandview. Mom made a small sound like air escaping. You sold a business? Charlotte's voice was faint. What business? Classroom Connect. It's an educational platform used by about 40,000 schools now. I built it while teaching, sold it in 2022. Derek was shaking his head. No, this is some kind of joke. It's not a joke. Margaret had appeared beside me, her expression professional but her eyes sharp. Ms. Patterson has owned these properties for 3 years. She's been an excellent owner, very hands-on during renovations, very supportive of staff, very committed to guest experience. But you're a teacher, Mom whispered. You teach preschool. I did teach preschool. I loved it. But I also built a company on the side, and when someone wanted to buy it, I sold it. Then I kept teaching for a while because I enjoyed it and eventually transitioned to consulting and investing. Why didn't you tell us? Dad demanded. I tried to. Remember when I said I'd changed jobs and was doing consulting work? You said consulting was just a fancy word for unemployment. When I mentioned I'd made some good investments, Derek said I probably put $100 in an index fund. When I offered to help Charlotte with her business startup costs, she said she didn't need pity money from her struggling sister. Each example landed like a physical blow. I could see them remembering, the memories clicking into place. But you still dress like... Brittany gestured at my outfit. Like you shop at clearance sales. I do shop at clearance sales. I like a good deal. Why would I spend $300 on a shirt when I can get one I like just as much for $30? And your car, Derek started, is reliable, fuel efficient, and paid off. I don't care about cars. Why would I spend money on something I don't care about? Your apartment, Charlotte said weakly. You live in a 1-bedroom apartment. I live in a 3-bedroom condo in Lincoln Park that I own outright. It has 1 bedroom because I don't need more space. Why would I maintain empty rooms? Dad sank into a nearby chair. This can't be real. It's very real, Dad. You're standing in the lobby of a hotel I own. You just tried to cancel my reservation at my own property. And for the past hour, you've been complaining about customer service to staff who report directly to me. Margaret stepped forward. Mr. Patterson, I need to inform you that hotel policy requires respectful treatment of all staff members. The complaints you made to the front desk staff were noted. Ms. Patterson has instructed us to flag your party for owner review. Owner review? Mom looked panicked. What does that mean? It means every aspect of your stay will be monitored, I said quietly. Every charge, every activity, every interaction with staff. Any further issues and your stay privileges can be revoked. Stay privileges? Dad's voice cracked. Maya, you can't be serious. You're going to kick us out. You kicked me out 2 hours ago. Told me I didn't belong here. Told me to find a motel I could afford. We didn't know. Know what? That I own the place. Or that I could actually afford to be here. I looked at each of them. Would it have mattered if I was just a teacher who'd saved up for this vacation? Would I have belonged then? No one answered. That's what I thought. I turned to Margaret. The Patterson party can stay, but the owner review flag remains active. Any staff complaints, any behavioral issues, any problems at all, I want to know immediately. Yes, ma'am. Maya, wait. Mom reached for me but I stepped back. I have a reservation here. Room I paid for. I'm going to check in now and enjoy the facilities. You all can do the same. But if you approach me, if you harass me, if you try to have another family meeting about how I don't belong here, I will have security escort you from the property. Are we clear? Dad's face was red. You can't do this. We're family. Family who told me I was an embarrassment. Family who didn't want me here. Kept my voice level. I'm giving you what you wanted. You get to enjoy your luxury vacation without worrying about your poor sister counting pennies. I'll be here too, but you won't have to acknowledge me. You can pretend I don't exist, just like you've been pretending my success doesn't exist for 3 years. We didn't know about your success. Charlotte protested. You never told us. I tried to tell you. You didn't listen. You made assumptions about who I was and what I was worth, and you never questioned those assumptions. Not once in 3 years did any of you ask me about my work, my investments, my life. You just decided I was failing and treated me accordingly. Sarah handed me a key card. Room 412, Ms. Patterson. Top floor, Lakeview. Your usual suite. Thank you, Sarah. I took the key, then looked back at my family one last time. Enjoy your vacation. Try to be kind to the staff. They work hard. I walked toward the elevators, my rolling suitcase trailing behind me. Behind me, I could hear my family erupting into urgent whispered conversation, but I didn't turn around. The elevator doors closed and I leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. My phone buzzed. A text from James Hendricks. Margaret briefed me. Are you okay? I typed back, fine. Just tired. Take the rest of the day. Decompress. I'll handle anything that comes up. Thanks, James. Another text, this time from a number I recognized as Charlotte's. Maya, please. We need to talk. This is insane. You can't just shut us out. Then Derek. You're being extremely immature about this. So we made a mistake. Get over it. Then Brittany. If you're really rich, why do you act so poor? That's honestly kind of manipulative. Then Mom. Sweetheart, I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding. Let's have dinner tonight and work this out like adults. Then Dad, this is absurd. I'm your father. You will speak to me with respect. I turned my phone off. The suite was beautiful, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, a king bed with luxury linens, a marble bathroom with a soaking tub. I'd stayed here dozens of times while overseeing renovations and operations. It felt more like home than my family had in years. I ordered room service, changed into comfortable clothes, sat on the balcony watching boats drift across the water while the sun set in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in this hotel, my family was probably still talking about me, trying to understand, trying to reconcile the sister they thought they knew with the reality they just discovered. Maybe feeling guilty, maybe feeling angry, maybe both. But that wasn't my problem to solve. I'd spent 3 years being quietly successful while they assumed I was struggling. 3 years of gentle corrections that were ignored, of accomplishments that were dismissed, of trying to share my life with people who'd already decided what my life was. I was done trying. Tomorrow I'd go to the spa, book a massage, maybe play a round of golf. Enjoy the resort I'd worked hard to restore and maintain. And if I happened to see my family in the hallways or restaurants, I'd smile politely and keep walking. They wanted me to find a place I belonged. I had. It just wasn't with them. My phone, still off, sat on the nightstand. I knew when I turned it back on there would be more messages. More demands for explanations, for conversations, for me to make them feel better about treating me poorly. But not tonight. Tonight I was going to soak in the enormous bathtub, watch a movie on the premium television, and sleep in 1,000 thread-count sheets at the hotel I owned. And tomorrow? Tomorrow I'd see if my family could manage to get through one day without embarrassing themselves at my resort. Somehow I doubted it.